The scholastic period of philosophy, that is the philosophy of the schoolman. Scholastic philosophy is roughly associated with that period of European history, often referred to as the Middle Ages or medieval Europe. Historians often designate the medieval period of European history as beginning with the fall of Rome in 476 CE by the invasion of the German king Odoacer. After years of incursions and invasions by various tribes from the east, including the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and others. Generally, the medieval period is considered to have lasted until the Italian Renaissance of approximately 1300 CE. This period of European history was marked by the dissolution of the far-flung Roman Empire and the social and political structure that supported the material and intellectual lives of its citizens. Indeed, basic civic and cultural institutions fell into disorder and disrepair during this period, including the intellectual traditions often associated with classic Greek Hellenism and Roman intellectualism that were such an important part of the Roman imperial culture. These dark ages also had an enormous effect on the practice and development of philosophical discourse, reflection, and inquiry. However, the Roman Catholic Church proved to be the single enduring institution of this period of social chaos. Indeed, the Christian Church came into ascendancy both ecclesiastically and politically during this time. Politically, throughout Europe, the Christian Church was the only source of social stability, cultural legitimacy, and preservation of knowledge and works of those intellectual traditions. Ecclesiastically, during this period of Christian Catholicism, developed the doctrines and theology as the disparate church communities began to coalesce around the common beliefs and internal structures to impose a unified canon of accepted biblical works, commentary, and encyclicals. Christianity had gained acceptability by 313 CE with its recognition by the Emperor Constantine with his Edict of Milan, and 10 years later became the official religion of Rome. Later, Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, further strengthening Christianity's status within the empire. Christianity also continued to develop the doctrinal views that would prove necessary for the cohesion that it sought among its far from church communities and established the Church of Rome and the papacy as the final arbiter of Christian belief and practice. Thus, during this period of Catholicism, there developed doctrines and theologies that imposed the now familiar Catholic teachings and authority over the now separate Catholic Christian Church. Thus, this period of Catholicism, much of which was accomplished through the early councils or meetings among early church leaders. through councils such as the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the First Council of Constantinople in 381, the Council of Ephesus in 431, the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, the Third Council of Constantinople in 1680, 1681, and finally the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, all of which served the purpose of unifying and imposing the developing early church doctrines and theologies. Thus, with the fall of Rome and its intellectual and cultural traditions, the Roman Catholic Church stood as the bulwark for these traditions as Europe sought to reconstitute itself into the modern collection of national states that we are familiar with today. Thus, philosophy of this period is submersed and integrated into those developing church theologies. The scholasticism is that period of philosophy associated with medieval Europe, in which the major works and reflections of Greco-Roman philosophy were integrated into the development of Christian doctrine and intellectual discourse. The central aspect and problem for this integration was the church doctrine that all such inquiry and reflection must agree with and support the accepted Christian view that God created the world with the earth and us as its center. As the center of all creation, with everything in service to God's chosen people, any intellectual reflections must serve the purpose of confirming this developed Christian view of the universe. The papacy, as God's representative on earth, had authority over all human matters. With that authority administered through the church offices in the various European feudal monarchies and principalities that had developed and sprung to existence during this period of European upheaval. And any inquiry or philosophy that did not support the hierarchy of existence and the worldview was deemed blasphemous and suppressed by the church until the advent of European Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Reformation period. Indeed, church doctrine made liberal use of certain Platonic and Aristotelian philosophies, for example, Plato's idealism and Aristotle's hierarchy of souls, albeit within the confines of church dogma. And thus we see in this drawing from an inside cover of Martin Luther's Bible, a rendition of that scholastic view of the universe, again with God as creator looking over the universe he created with the earth in the center and God's chosen as holding dominion over that earth, and the implication then that the papacy has final authority over that dominion as God's representative. Further commentary concerning the development of scholasticism and its inculcation into developing church philosophy can be found in a scholastic miscellany, Anselm to Occam, and Fairweather's General Introduction. In this account, Fairweather comments on and defends the intellectual achievement of medieval Christendom. This commentary provides for us further insight into the classical philosophical traditions as they were integrated into church doctrine and the developments of its theology. He begins with a discussion of the church's rethinking of Hellenism, Greek philosophy, into a Christian philosophy. This is an attempt to think of grace and nature, faith and reason, Christianity and culture, God and his creation. Philosophy presented both the opportunity and the challenge of confronting the problems of Christian faith and human knowledge. It is also noteworthy that the church intelligentsia were teachers to both church and secular leaders, as well as those thinkers whose work would eventually reshape much of what would become European learning. This was an intellectual movement toward the synthesis of grace and nature. A survey of the terms of this development shows the making of Europe from the chaos of the fall of Rome, as well as the triumph of barbarism and feudalism to fill the social and cultural voids. With the resurgence of urban life, for example, and most primarily England and France, under the unifying influences of the Latin Church of the 12th and 14th centuries, we begin to see both the dialectic of achievement and defeat. Under this influence, the fragmentation of early Middle Ages begins to give way to an organized European community and principalities that are bound by common interests, economics, military, and Christendom. The Latin patristic traditions that study the early foundations and leaders of the church provided not just an historical consistency and lineage, but also the West's repository of truth and Roman prestige and culture. This augmented the necessity of education for power and authority, as well as the intellectual study and reflection. This authority manifested itself within the offices of the papacy to impose order and discipline on a still chaotic Europe. This in turn further protected and fostered intellectual activity, the development of canonical law, and the order establishing Rome as mother and mistress of all churches. The development of the intellectual side of the medieval church, which was largely confined to the abbeys and monasteries in the early medieval period, eventually led and gave way to the great universities of Europe, developing from and within the monastic cathedral. And the associated communities. Eventually, these academic communities expanded from the narrow religious curriculum in the service of doctrinal development and theology to the broader intellectual interests, including dialectic discourse and thesis. Indeed, the advent of the universities heralded greater contact with the world beyond Europe and Christendom, including the Muslim world, as well as the development of what we now consider the liberal arts curriculum. As the universities became the center of intellectual development, both out of necessity and opportunity, Aristotle's classical metaphysics and science became a central focus in study and progress. Indeed, the progressive rediscovery of Aristotle from Muslim and Hellenistic communities exercised enormous influence over the formulation of Christian philosophy. This was reflected in the development of theology, organization, and method from Aristotelian syllogistic logic, exposition, and analysis. And this included the Neoplatonistic philosophies of Islamic scholars such as Averroes. Inevitably, this led to Aquinas' attempts to systemize Aristotle within his own novel conclusions in theology. Bonaventure's reformulation of Augustine philosophy in response to Aristotelianism, and even later Franciscan, that, for example, William of Ockham's challenging of Aristotelian interpretation of nature and divine will. Much of the early church doctrine and theology reflects the dominance of St. Augustine. Not surprisingly, Augustinian and Neoplatonist philosophies continue to account for much of the basis of Christian theology. This was one of the first uses of philosophy in service to Christian theology, providing an intellectual basis alongside the ecclesiastical experience. This early Christian philosophy dealt with such basic questions, interpreted through the guidance of Augustine philosophy, as the nature of God, the condition of man, and that union of man with God. From the perspective of the development of the Christian religion and medieval European culture, the significance of scholasticism cannot be overstated. Philosophy during this period of history does continue its work in metaphysics, anthropology, logic, and science, albeit constrained within the dogmas of church authority. It oversaw the continuity of the Greco-Roman Western culture and thought. For example, Aquinas' metaphysics of existence, Christian apologetics, and theology. I hope that this helps place the medieval philosophies of scholasticism within their larger cultural and historical context, and providing a general worldview within which scholastic philosophy developed.